Wyoming Valley, Pennsylvania, September 1878. The spectacle on the hillside above the Susquehanna Coal Company's patch number 4 was enough to stop work. 10 mules, their muscles bunched into knots of straining leather and flesh, dug their hooves into the earth. They were dragging a ghost from the industrial age, a 30-ton Cornish boiler, condemned and rust-streaked, inch by agonizing inch up the slope. Guiding the team with low, calm words, in a language the valley didn't recognize, was Ondrej Hreško. At the company store porch, a small group of men watched. Silas Croft, a faceman whose hands were permanently blackened with coal dust, shook his head. What in God's name is the Slovak doing with that scrap? Evan Pugh, a timberman with shoulders as broad as a mine entrance, spat a stream of tobacco juice. Heard he's building a house from a boiler. The man's gone mad. The third man said nothing for a long moment. He was not a miner. He was Tobias Lankenow, a clerk for the company, a man of ledgers and neat, spidery script. His world was one of inventory, assets, and scrap value. He watched the colossal iron cylinder, a thing he knew was still technically on the company books, being dragged onto a patch of land it had no right to be on by a man who had no claim to it. He saw not madness, but liability. That's company property, Lankenow said, his voice quiet, but edged with the certainty of a man who knows the rules. It hasn't been weighed out. That's theft, is what that is. He made a small, precise note in the pocket ledger he always carried. The word he wrote next to Hreško's name was not mad or foolish. It was debit. The mockery rippled through the patch town for weeks as Ondrej dug a massive pit, 7 feet deep, and with a series of levers and earthen ramps, settled the 30-ton iron tube into the embrace of the hillside. He wasn't building a house on the land, he was building it in the land. To the men who built their flimsy board and batten houses to stand against the wind, this was the act of a fool building his own tomb. They saw a man burying a metal can, an act of profound and inexplicable strangeness. They saw a waste of effort that would surely collapse or fill with water, or simply become a frozen iron crypt come the first deep frost. What did this Slovak coppersmith, this Bansky kotlar from the old country, understand about the slow physics of iron and water that a valley of experienced miners and builders, men who lived and died by steam and pressure, had so completely missed? Before we witness how Ondrej Hreško turned 30 tons of industrial scrap into a sanctuary of warmth, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to unearth these forgotten stories of ingenuity. I promise, by the end of this account, you will understand how the simple principle of hydronic convection, harnessed by a massive thermal battery, can defeat the most brutal cold. And let us know in the comments, what is the strangest material you have ever seen used to build a home? Ondrej Hreško was not a carpenter. His hands knew the heft of a brazing torch, not a framing hammer. He was not a mason. He could not lay a course of stone to save his life. He was a Bansky kotlar, a colliery coppersmith from the mineral-rich Spiš region of what would one day be called Slovakia. For 20 years, his world had been the deep, damp heat of the mine works, his trade the intricate circulatory systems of the great steam-driven pumps. He didn't build the boilers. He gave them their lifeblood. With copper pipe and silver solder, he fashioned the complex water jackets that kept the massive iron hearts from overheating or exploding. He understood how water, when heated, moved with a purpose as undeniable as gravity. He knew its quiet, relentless power to carry warmth from one place to another. His hands knew the language of thermal transfer, spoken in the dialect of copper and iron. This knowledge was useless, it seemed, in America. Here he was just another hunky, a strong back for digging coal, his specialized craft irrelevant. And the price of that irrelevance had been paid during his family's first Pennsylvania winter. They had lived in a shed thrown together from scrap lumber and roofed with tarred canvas, a structure that breathed the winter wind through 1,000 tiny gaps. He remembered the sheets of ice that grew like glass panes on the inside of the walls, thickening with every passing day. He remembered his wife, Zuzana, her face etched with a fear he had never seen in the old country, piling every blanket they owned onto their 2 children, Jan and Katerina. He remembered the sight that had broken something in him and forged a new resolve. In the pale dawn light, he had seen the vapor of his children's breath rising from the shared pillow, 2 small, ghostly columns in the frigid air of their own bedroom. That same morning, the flour in its bin was not a powder. It was a single pebble-hard stone of frozen grain. They had survived, but it was not living. It was the endurance of animals in a burrow, and Ondrej swore his family would never face another winter like that. He had seen the condemned Cornish boiler lying in the scrapyard, and he had not seen a piece of junk. He had seen a vessel. He had seen a chance. He had seen the shape of a home that understood the cold not as an enemy to be fought, but as an immensity to be patiently, quietly, and completely ignored. The conventional miner's cabin in the Wyoming Valley was a masterclass in thermal failure. These were structures built for speed, not for comfort. Erected in a matter of days, their single-wall board and batten construction offered minimal resistance to the cold. The gaps between the boards were chinked with a mixture of mud, straw, and horsehair, a pathetic defense that cracked and crumbled, opening up dozens of tiny highways for frigid air. The heart of this failing system was the pot-belly stove. It was a hungry, inefficient beast. To keep a room livable, it had to be fed a constant diet of wood or coal, roaring at full blast. This created a small, oppressive bubble of heat in the immediate vicinity of the stove, while 6 feet away, water would freeze in its bucket. The problem wasn't the stove's heat output. The problem was physics. The stove primarily heated the air through convection. This superheated air would rise to the ceiling, push the cold air down, and then leak out of the house through the countless gaps in the walls and the uninsulated roof. A family was effectively trying to heat the entire state of Pennsylvania. The structure itself, the walls and floors, remained freezing cold. They were thermal liabilities, constantly sucking warmth out of the living space. Silas Croft's family, like many others, spent the winter in a state of siege. They burned a cord of wood every 4 days, an immense expenditure of labor and money. They stuffed rags into the cracks around the window frames, a battle they lost every night. They would wake to find a thick layer of frost not on the outside of their window panes, but on the inside. Blankets would be stiff with frozen condensation from their own breath. It was a life spent huddled, shivering, and perpetually feeding a fire that gave them only a temporary and ultimately losing reprieve from the cold. The valley's builders knew how to make a box to keep out the rain, but they did not know how to build a vessel to hold on to heat. Ondrej Hreško's construction project was, by contrast, a slow, deliberate process of creating such a vessel. The first step had been acquiring the boiler. It was a monster, 40 feet long and 6 feet in diameter, its iron plates 1.5 inches thick. Condemned due to a dozen weeping rivets, it was destined to be broken up for scrap. Ondrej approached the yard boss, a man named Evans, and offered him $5, the equivalent of a week's wages. Evans, seeing a fool willing to haul away his garbage for him, took the money and looked the other way. The real cost was in labor. The 10-mule team, borrowed from a sympathetic farmer, took 2 full days to drag the 30-ton cylinder up the gentle slope to the spot Ondrej had chosen. Then came the digging. For a month, Using only a pick and shovel, he carved a massive trench into the hillside, a grave for a metal giant. Finally, with a system of greased logs and immense levers, he and a few other Slovak immigrants he'd paid in food and future favors rolled the boiler into the pit. The earth of the hillside now embraced the boiler on three sides, providing an immense, natural insulation that no wooden wall could ever match. It was during this phase that Tobias Lankenau made his official visit. He walked up the hill, his good shoes sullied by the mud, his ledger held tight in his hand. He found Ondrej halfway inside the boiler's firebox, cleaning out years of soot and scale. "Hreško," Lankenau called out, his voice echoing in the iron tube. "I am here on behalf of the Susquehanna Coal Company. This boiler," he patted the rusty flank of the machine, "is still on our scrap ledger. It has not been properly weighed, documented, or paid for. By removing it from the yard, you have committed theft of company property." Ondrej slowly emerged from the firebox, his face and arms black with soot. He looked at the clerk, a man who saw the world as a series of accounts to be balanced. He did not argue or raise his voice. "Is scrap," he said simply. "I paid Mr. Evans $5. "Mr. Evans has no authority to sell assets off the books," Lankenau retorted, his bureaucratic certainty unshaken. "I could have the constable up here right now. The company values this asset at $40 scrap weight. You will either pay the full amount, or we will be forced to reclaim our property." He made another sharp, angry note in his book. The pressure of his pencil laid a testament to his indignation. Ondrej just nodded. "I pay," he said, and turned back to his work. $40 was a fortune, a debt that would take him months to clear. But it was nothing compared to the price of another winter in the tar paper shack. With the ownership settled, Ondrej began the real work, the work of a Bansky Kotlar. Inside the cavernous iron shell, he began to construct his heating system. It was a thing of beauty and precision. In the firebox, where a raging coal fire once turned water to steam, he brazed a large, flat coil of 2-inch copper pipe. From this coil, 2 pipes ran up into the main barrel of the boiler. These pipes then branched out, running along the upper curve of the boiler's interior, like arteries hugging the inside of a great iron rib cage. The pipes then curved back down along the floor and returned to the bottom of the firebox coil, completing a closed loop. He was not building a stove. He was building a circulatory system, a silent gravity-powered engine designed to move heat. To the few who peered inside, it looked like a madman's plumbing, a useless and expensive decoration inside a metal cave. They saw pipes. Ondrej saw the veins of a living home. To understand the genius of Ondrej Hreško's boiler house, you must understand the failure of the potbelly stove. A stove burns fuel to heat air. The Wyoming Valley winter could produce over 500,000 cubic feet of lethally cold air per acre. Trying to heat that air inside a leaky wooden box was like trying to fill the ocean with a bucket. It was a battle of brute force, and the winter always won. Ondrej's system didn't heat the air. It heated the house itself. The principle was hydronic convection, a force as simple and reliable as a stone rolling downhill. When Ondrej built a small, modest fire in the boiler's firebox, using far less wood than a conventional stove, the heat was absorbed by the water inside the copper coil. As the water heated, it expanded and became less dense. This lighter, hotter water naturally rose, climbing up the pipes into the main living chamber. Here was the crucial step. The warm water flowing through the copper pipes didn't aggressively radiate heat into the room. Instead, it was in direct contact with the inner walls of the boiler. Through conduction, the pipes transferred their thermal energy, their British thermal units, or BTUs, directly into the 1.5-inch thick cast iron plates of the boiler shell. The 30 tons of iron began to slowly, steadily absorb the warmth. The water, having given up its heat to the iron, became cooler and denser. Gravity then pulled this cooler water down the pipes that ran along the floor, returning it to the firebox coil to be heated once more. This created a silent, continuous, self-regulating loop. It was a gravity-powered pump with no moving parts, but the true secret was not the circulation. It was the storage. The 30 tons of iron, coupled with the surrounding tons of earth, formed an enormous thermal battery. Ondrej wasn't trying to create a blast of heat. He was slowly charging his home with warmth. Once the massive iron shell reached a stable temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit, it would take many, many hours for it to cool down. The iron itself became the heater. It radiated a gentle, even warmth from all directions: the walls, the floor, the ceiling. There were no cold spots. There were no drafts. A single, efficient firing in the morning and another in the evening was enough to keep the iron saturated with heat, which it would then release slowly and steadily for 18 hours. He had turned a 30-ton liability into a 30-ton thermal asset. That January, the winter came not as a storm, but as a suffocating stillness. A high-pressure system from the Arctic Circle settled over the eastern seaboard and refused to move. For 11 days, the Wyoming Valley was trapped in what meteorologists would later call an Arctic stagnation. The air, dense and heavy, pooled in the valley like a frozen lake. There was no wind. Smoke from the hundreds of chimneys in the patch towns did not drift or swirl. It rose in perfectly vertical, unwavering columns, memorials of wasted heat against a pale and pitiless sky. The temperature fell to 20 degrees, below zero, then 30. On the fourth day, the official reading at the company office was minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. It stayed there for a week. The world seemed to stop. The river froze solid enough to support coal wagons. The grease in the mine lift gears turned to wax. Men who had to work outside came back with white patches of frostbite on their cheeks and noses. For the families in the board and batten cabins, it was a waking nightmare. The insatiable stoves ran day and night. The wood piles vanished. Men began burning fence posts, then furniture. At the Croft house, Silas and his family abandoned all rooms but the kitchen. They nailed their blankets over the doorway and huddled together, feeding splintered chair legs into the stove. Their windows were no longer transparent. They were opaque white squares, coated on the inside with an inch-thick layer of ice that grew thicker every day. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that had breached their walls and could not be driven out. But on the hillside, inside the buried boiler, the laws of physics were different. Ondrej Hreško would rise in the chilled but not freezing morning air. He would load the firebox with a few logs of seasoned oak, enough to burn slowly for 2 hours. The silent hydronic loop would begin its work, recharging the iron walls. By the time the fire had burned down to coals, the home was secure for the day. The temperature inside the boiler held at a steady, unbelievable 70 degrees. There was no drama. There was only a profound and revolutionary normalcy. The air was so still you could hear the soft hiss of the coal oil lamp. Zuzana spent the days mending shirts, her sewing basket beside her. On the small shelf Ondrej had bolted to the wall, a jar of ink for writing letters back to Spesh sat, its contents perfectly liquid. The children, Jan and Katarina, were not bundled in layers of wool. They were playing on a small braided rug on the gently curved iron floor. There whirled a bubble of impossible warmth, shielded from the lethal stillness outside by 30 tons of patient, slow-releasing iron. On the 10th day of the Arctic stagnation, Tobias Lankenau sat in the frigid company office, a wool blanket draped over his shoulders, and tried to reconcile his year-end accounts. His breath plumed in the air. The ink in his heavy glass inkwell was a solid, useless disk of black ice. He stared at the entry in his ledger: boiler, Cornish, 1 each. Debit, SCC property. Hreško, $40. The account was still unpaid, but another more pressing issue had come up. The official scrap-out weight for the yard was short by approximately 30 tons. An auditor was coming from Philadelphia. Lankenau, a man who prided himself on perfect balances, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew where the missing tonnage was. Bundled in his heaviest greatcoat, he left the office and began to walk. He didn't head for Hreško's old shack. He followed the memory of the furrows carved into the earth months before. The deep scars in the frozen ground were still visible, a trail leading up the bare, snow-dusted hillside. He expected to find a disaster, a collapsed pit, a man frozen in his own foolish tomb. Instead, he found almost nothing. The landscape was smooth, a white mound that seemed a natural part of the hill. The only sign of human life was a single, narrow stovepipe, barely 3 feet high, emerging from the snow. From it vented a thin, clean plume of smoke, rising straight and steady into the dead-still air. It was not the frantic, heavy smoke of a stove fighting for its life. It was a calm, measured exhalation, a breath. Lankenau stood there 20 yards away, his mind struggling to process the scene. There was no house. There was only a snowdrift with a chimney. He was looking at the home without recognizing it as one. The sheer quietness of it, the absolute lack of struggle, was more shocking than any roaring fire could ever be. He stood for a long time, the brutal -34-degree air clawing at his face, and simply watched the impossible sight of a home that had made peace with the winter. He didn't confront Ondrej that day. The vindication was too complete, the failure of his own worldview too total. When the freeze finally broke, he found Ondrej splitting wood. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention the $40. He just asked a single honest question. How? Ondrej, sensing the genuine curiosity behind the clerk's usual arrogance, put down his axe and led him to the boiler. He opened the small, insulated door and gestured for Lankenau to enter. The clerk stepped across the threshold, and the world changed. The air was warm, soft, and utterly still. He felt it on his face, a gentle, radiant heat that came from everywhere at once. Ondrej explained the system, pointing to the pipes, tapping the thick iron wall, describing the slow, patient circulation of the water. The true moment of conversion, the final breaking of Lankenau's certainty, came a week later during another cold snap. He visited at dawn on the pretense of discussing a payment plan for the boiler. He found Zuzana at a small table, writing a letter to her family in the old country. She dipped her quill pen into a simple glass jar of ink. The ink was thin and black. It flowed from the nib onto the paper without a single frozen crystal. Lankenau, whose own office inkwell was once again a solid block, stared at the jar. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the glass. It was cool, but it was the coolness of a cellar, not the biting cold of the grave. In that small, mundane detail, the simple liquidity of ink on a shelf, he saw the entirety of Ondrej's genius. This wasn't a house. It was a different season. You didn't build a shelter, he thought, his mind struggling for the right words. You built a harbor. Tobias Lankenau, the man of ledgers, became Ondrej Hreško's greatest advocate. He used his neat, precise script not to issue debits, but to draw up plans. He documented the dimensions of the boiler, the layout of the copper piping, the design of the firebox. The story, now authenticated by a company man, spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community of Slovak and Polish immigrants. It was a story of one of their own, using old-world knowledge to solve a new-world problem. The Slovak Lodge in Hazleton, a mutual aid society dedicated to the welfare of its members, saw the profound implications. This was not just a curiosity, it was a blueprint for survival. In their 1879 winter circular, alongside notices of births and benevolent fund collections, they printed Lankenau's drawing. It was a simple cross-section, the boiler nestled in the earth, the elegant loop of the hydronic system clearly marked, with notes on materials and construction. The circular was sent to 10 parishes throughout the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania. By the following winter, 3 more families, having salvaged their own condemned boilers from other collieries, were living in the slow, steady warmth of the earth. Ondrej Hreško had no vocabulary for what he had created. He had never heard the terms thermal mass or passive solar design or radiant hydronic heating, yet he had built a home that perfectly embodied all 3. He had created an earth-sheltered structure that used the ground as insulation, a high-mass system that stored energy like a battery, and a heating loop that anticipated the most advanced sustainable building principles by a full century. He was a pioneer, not of the frontier, but of physics. The Wyoming Valley rewarded noise and speed. It valued the violent blast of dynamite that shattered rock, the roar of the colliery furnaces, the frantic, desperate burning of fuel to beat back the cold. Everything was a fight, a constant high-energy struggle against the forces of nature. Ondrej Hreško's innovation was the precise opposite. It was an act of quietness, of patience, of immense and profound slowness. He did not try to overpower the winter. He simply built a vessel that the winter could not touch. He looked at 30 tons of cold iron and saw not a wall, but a reservoir. He asked the iron to be slow, to absorb heat slowly, to store it deeply, and to release it gently. He asked the iron to be slow, and slow is what carried his family through. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this account valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of forgotten history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe this kind of simple, high-mass building has a place in our modern world? The reconstructions and events depicted in this video are inspired by historical practices and are presented for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters and specific events are fictionalized. Any application of these historical techniques in a modern context should be done in compliance with current building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.